Joe Potter is policy manager at Samaritans, and he is going to talk about promising interventions for supporting middle-aged men at risk of suicide. Now, I know that loneliness is a particular interest of Samaritans. And actually, even before lockdown, there was a survey that Samaritans published, which I tweeted just before this, which showed that 1 in 3 people who call Samaritans disclose they feel lonely or isolated. And of course, that was pre-lockdown. And also, Samaritans are very interested in middle-aged men because they are the group at highest risk of suicide. So, Joe, it's a 10-minute talk. I'll give you a 1-minute warning before the end. I think I gave Roz a slightly early 1-minute warning. I apologise, but I will be on time for you. Over to you, Joe.
Great, thank you. I'll just share my screen. So, thank you very much for having me. So it's a short talk on promising interventions for supporting middle-aged men at risk of suicide. My name is Joe Potter, Policy Manager at Samaritans. I'm going to be talking to you about some research that we did earlier this year. I think for better or for worse, my presentation is going to be slightly less academic actually than some of the others that you'll hear this afternoon, but hopefully it will provide a bit of a contrast. So Samaritans undertook this research, out of sight, out of mind, why less well-off middle-aged men don't get the support that they need. As a bit of background to why Samaritans are so interested or concerned about this group, probably many of you will know that men in the UK and Ireland are between 3 and 4 times more likely to die by suicide than women. That middle-aged men in the UK have experienced the highest suicide rates for decades. It's extremely persistently high rates. So the issue of suicide is a complex one, but it's definitely an issue of gender, but also of deprivation and of inequality. So we know that men, less well-off men living in the most deprived areas are up to 10 times more likely to die by suicide than those better off men living in the most affluent areas. So a really quite stark representation of that issue of inequality. Unfortunately, we know there is an association between suicide and loneliness. According to Wiley et al., men tend to feel more lonely than women, even when they're not socially isolated. And in general, and this is something that Samaritans research on the topic has also brought up, is that men tend to have fewer meaningful connections than women, and that their social networks can be less supportive. And that's something that was definitely sort of received bear out in this research that I'm going to speak to you about. So why are less well-off middle-aged men particularly high risk? It's really important to start by saying, to go back to the point that suicide is incredibly complex. It's rarely caused or never caused by one issue alone, and that there's a sort of interplay of social, psychological, interpersonal factors which increase risk for middle-aged men, but for everyone. It's really important to get that, to acknowledge the various factors that come into play. We know that men can be less open about talking about their emotions and have fewer social skills than women, that they're more likely to engage in risky behavior when facing stress, so substance misuse, violence, and that men tend to have less strong social support networks outside of their primary relationship. And what we see is where relationship breakdown happens in midlife, men are left without the sort of support, the equivalent support networks that their ex-partner might have. Worth saying that this research was undertaken before the COVID outbreak, that we at Samaritans are really concerned about how lockdown would have exacerbated problems for these men in terms of social disconnection. And that as we look forward to a possible or probable recession, we know that middle-aged men for whom there are key risk factors around job loss and problem debt are going to be particularly hard hit. So for the research, we undertook interviews with a relatively small sample of 16 less well-off middle-aged men across the UK and Ireland. We undertook ethnographic interviews with them, so really dug down into what was going on for these men, where they were struggling, and crucially, what they wanted and what they needed from services when they were struggling. I think it's fair to say there's lots of good work going on around supporting this group, but the evidence base we found was relatively poor in terms of formal evidence base of what works. So social connection was a really common theme, the most common theme, I would say, amongst the men that we spoke to. We found them to be disconnected from the people, the places, and the networks around them. And I think what was quite shocking is the significant amount of time that these men had spent without connections. They'd been struggling for a really long time with poor mental health, and that sort of, in terms of poor mental health, that covered a wide range of experience, from men that have been having low-level anxiety, depression, right up to people that historically might have even made a suicide attempt. So we had quite a range of people and experiences within the cohort. Important to note that while some did have social connections, a lot of the time this might be based around substance misuse or other sort of behaviours, which actually those relationships weren't necessarily providing such a protective factor as they might do because of the basis of which they're on. And it was notable how, as problems mounted, these men started to withdraw from their support networks as things got worse. We found that many opportunities to engage these men when they came into contact with services, those opportunities were missed, and support came very late. So normally once one of the cohort represented were really at their lowest ebb. They might have been a risk to themselves or to others. Support came in then, not so much earlier, when their problems were potentially more manageable and where social interventions could have worked better. But those men didn't necessarily see interventions in the community as being relevant to them. So they might have come into contact with services that would have helped them with their substance misuse, but wouldn't take that extra step to actually ask, well, what's going on for you in terms of your social connection, aside from your drug use or aside from alcoholism, for instance. We wanted to get to a place where it wasn't just about identifying what was going wrong. We really wanted to understand, by speaking to these men without making assumptions, what they wanted from services when they're struggling. And there were a few sort of key themes that came up, and the theme of inclusivity, inclusive initiatives, when services did get involved, when these men felt ready to reach out to community-based initiatives in their areas. They wanted to feel a sense of inclusivity. So that would, a lot of the time, that came from peer support and being involved in initiatives with people from their community. So I think a theme that came up time and again is that men didn't want to feel like they were being fixed, or that there was a kind of a top-down model as to, you've got a problem, we're going to help you fix it. They wanted to get involved in initiatives which were built and sort of grew organically out of their communities, run by people that they could identify with as having had similar experiences or knew where they were coming from. They were more likely to engage with and stay engaged with initiatives that sort of felt authentic. They also wanted to be involved with, we call it purposeful goals, but that's really working towards projects, working on things which they felt, where the men felt they were making a contribution. Again, comes back to that issue of not being fixed. It was more that they could go along to to a club, to a men's shed, to any kind of manner of sort of project-based intervention where they felt, thank you, that they felt they were making a real contribution, that they felt they weren't just making up the numbers, they were being useful. And that was a really useful way actually of getting around the stigma of having to ask for help. It wasn't about going and saying, I need your help. It was more about, I've got something that I can add, something that I can contribute. So that's a very whistle-stop tour through the research, and yeah, happy to take any questions. I'll stop sharing my screen.
Brilliant, thank you. So let me look through the questions. We've got a few comments about things like men liking to fix, not to be fixed, which is an interesting reflection on the kind of interventions that were identified there. David McDade has made the point, presumably work provides some access to social support for men, or are those work networks very shallow? And I know that you know, Samaritans are particularly interested in the construction industry. I'm just reflecting back on ONS statistics about the occupational groups at higher risk of suicide. And it's interesting that one of the factors in the construction industry has been the sense that a lot of men either work in the construction industry and women work in relatively isolated setups. And even if they are working as part of a team, there might be quite shallow connections between them. Did you want to comment on that?
Sure. So there's a couple of things there. We did find one of the things, obviously it was a relatively small sample, but there was a commonality of men kind of coming in and out of work and their mental health kind of tracking that. So consistent work was definitely a protective factor, and many of those who had suffered most had struggled in terms of keeping up consistent work, but also there was something about, there might have been men that were in work, but where that was insecure and they were in and out of work in more informal sort of working situations, that was something that they found really difficult and could be, you know, job loss was a trigger for lots of other issues that we found. In terms of the construction industry, yeah, we're doing a bit of work around that at the moment, and I think there's a number of issues there. So being away from home for long periods of time, being housed in hotels, away from your family in bits of the country that, you know, are unknown, that can be really problematic. And it's the insecurity and unpredictability of that form of work which can be particularly problematic.
And I think we've got time for one more question, and that's from Sudhir Shah, who's asked, did you notice any differences by ethnicity in your work?
So it's something that we worked hard to get somewhere close to a representative sample, but that was something that I think we'd have liked it. It wasn't fully representative in terms of ethnicity, but that they were added. We found some issues in terms of ways that men would become withdrawn from their support networks and families. There were variations in the extent to which men felt that they could. So from some ethnic minorities, men felt less able to reach out specifically to close family, to talk about, for instance, at the more acute end of things, when they might have been feeling suicidal. Those conversations were particularly difficult for some groups, but unfortunately, our sample wasn't representative enough to make sort of really strong conclusions in that regard.
I mean, it's worth commenting that even national suicide data don't even have ethnicity data, which is ridiculous, but it just shows how important this kind of work is in understanding patterns of suicide. But thank you very much, Joe. I will have to move on to the next speaker, but thank you very much for that presentation.